There is a moment in life when everything you have called failure ceases to feel like a punishment and begins to reveal its true nature. It's not the time when you lose a job, see a relationship end, or witness years of effort crumble before your eyes. It is the silent instant when an impossible question crosses your mind. What if all this had never been a mistake? What if the very thing you tried most to avoid was the only path capable of leading you to what you have always been? Few men have understood this mystery as deeply as Carl Jung. For him, no great transformation is born of comfort. The soul never awakens as long as the persona remains sufficient to sustain the illusion of who we believe ourselves to be. It is only when this structure begins to crack that the unconscious finds space to speak. And when he speaks, he rarely uses words. It manifests itself through losses, crises, ruptures, and events that the ego insists on calling bad luck. Maybe you came to this video believing that your biggest failure represents the darkest chapter of your story. But Jung would invite you to look at this moment from another angle. But he would ask something that few people have the courage to answer. Who exactly failed? It was your true self, or just the identity you built to survive? Observe the stories that mark generations. Walter White did not become unforgettable because he chose the path of destruction. Tony Soprano didn't hold millions of viewers just for his violence or for his power. Both awakened something profound because they represent a universal psychological truth. At some point, what sustained their identities began to crumble. The carefully constructed character was no longer able to hide what existed in the depths of the psyche. We do not admire your choices. We recognize, without even realizing it, the collapse of the persona. Joseph Campbell spent decades studying myths spread across civilizations, separated by oceans, languages, and thousands of years of history. What he found seemed impossible. Peoples who had never had contact with each other told exactly the same story. A hero receives a call. He refuses this call. He loses everything he believed he was. It descends into the darkest regions of existence, and he returns completely transformed. But Campbell never claimed that this structure was born only of human imagination. Much of his understanding was inspired by the work of Carl Jung. Jung saw something even deeper. For him, these myths did not describe external adventures. They revealed the secret map of the collective unconscious. Each archetype, each symbol, each descent into the unknown represented real movements of the human soul towards the process of individuation. That's why these stories continue to move people centuries after they were first told. They don't talk about distant heroes. They talk about you. There is a battle going on right now within your consciousness. On one side is the persona, this identity carefully constructed throughout life. She learned which words elicit approval, which behaviors generate recognition, and which emotions need to remain hidden to ensure acceptance. She was not born out of malice. It was born out of necessity. It was the way found by the ego to survive the world. On the other side, there remains something much older. Jung called it the self. It's not a better version of you. It is not an enhanced personality. It is the silent center of the psyche, the essence that existed before any mask, before family expectations, before society's demands, and even before the countless adaptations that made you believe that you needed to be someone different to deserve love, respect, or success. As long as the persona functions, the self remains hidden. And herein lies one of the greatest paradoxes of existence. Often what we call success is precisely what takes us further away from our inner truth. When everything seems to be working, we rarely question whether we are living our own life or just playing a role that we have learned to play with excellence. Jung warned that what remains unconscious does not disappear. On the contrary, it becomes destiny. The shadow grows silently whenever we reject legitimate parts of our nature. Forgotten dreams, abandoned talents, repressed emotions, stifled desires, and untapped potentials do not cease to exist. They just descend into deep regions of the psyche, where they continue to influence every choice without us noticing. Maybe that's exactly what you're feeling. A concern that is difficult to explain. A feeling of emptiness that no achievement can completely fill. The impression that there is something waiting to be born, but that it remains trapped behind an invisible door. You keep advancing, you achieve goals, you get recognition, but something inside you insists that you haven't found the true path yet. Carl Jung would never interpret this restlessness as weakness. He would say that this discomfort is a calling, a call that does not come from the world, but from the unconscious. It is the beginning of individuation, the moment when the soul begins to demand that the life built by the persona is no longer enough to contain what you really are. But there is a problem. The persona never voluntarily surrenders control. She will fight to preserve every piece of the identity it took years to build. The greater the recognition, the greater the resistance. The more perfect your life seems, the harder it will be to admit that something essential remains absent. This is precisely why transformation almost never begins through a conscious choice. It usually arrives disguised as a loss, failure, or collapse. And when this happens, almost everyone believes they are facing the worst moment of their lives. However, Carl Jung would see this very instant as the first sign that the true awakening has finally begun. This is exactly where the journey ceases to belong to the ego, and it is led by the soul. There is a moment that almost no one notices when it is happening. It does not arrive accompanied by great tragedies or dramatic announcements. It comes up during an ordinary morning on the way to work as you watch people hurrying through the streets. It appears when you finish another productive day, and even so, you feel an emptiness that is impossible to explain. Or maybe it happens when everyone praises your life, but something inside you remains strangely silent. Carl Jung said that the unconscious rarely screams. First, he whispers, and those who ignore his whispers end up hearing his screams. Maybe you know this feeling. You wake up, fulfill your responsibilities, solve problems, talk to people, smile when necessary, and continue to play the role you've built for years perfectly. In the eyes of the world, everything seems to be working. However, when you're finally left alone, a question arises that you quickly try to push aside. Is this really the life I'm supposed to be living? Most people don't answer this question. They find distractions. They turn on the television, pick up their cell phones, work a few more hours, or create new goals, believing that the next achievement will finally fill that empty space. But the emptiness remains. Not because there is a lack of success, money, or recognition. It remains because that which is asking for attention does not belong to the outside world. It belongs to the unconscious. Carl Jung understood this phenomenon like few others. For him, every person receives at different moments of existence an inner calling. It is not a supernatural voice. It's not a spectacular revelation. It is a discrete perception that there is a direction that insists on appearing, even when we do everything possible to ignore it. This is the beginning of the true process of individuation, but almost no one accepts this invitation immediately. Joseph Campbell identified the same pattern in virtually all of humanity's great myths. The hero receives a call and almost always rejects it, not because he is a coward, but because abandoning the security of what he already knows seems irrational. Carl Jung would say that this refusal is born of the persona. After all, persona was built precisely to maintain stability, approval, and predictability. She does not want profound changes. She wants to survive. Think about how many times you've clearly recognized what you needed to do, and yet you put off that decision. Maybe it was going to start a project that has always aroused enthusiasm. Maybe it was ending a relationship that no longer represented who you were. Maybe it would be changing professions, moving to another city, or simply admitting to himself that he was living to meet expectations that were never really his. The instant this truth appeared, another voice emerged soon after. Now is not the time. First, I need more security. After everything is organized, I start. These phrases seem sensible. They look ripe. They seem responsible. However, Jung observed that they are often just sophisticated mechanisms created by the persona to prevent any approximation with the self. It is curious to see how this dynamic is repeated in completely different people. An executive achieves the position he has always wanted, buys the house of his dreams, and offers comfort to his family. Still, she feels an exhaustion that rest does not solve. An artist abandons her passion to follow a profession considered safer. Years later, he can't explain why he completely lost his zest for life. A couple stays together for decades because everything seems stable, even when they both know in silence that the relationship stopped feeding their souls a long time ago. None of this happens all at once. It is a slow process. Each time you choose the safest path instead of the truest one, a small part of your life is left unlived. Jung drew attention to this phenomenon because he knew that what is not consciously experienced does not disappear. Go to the shadow, and the shadow is not composed only of fears or negative impulses. It also holds forgotten talents, abandoned dreams, repressed sensibilities, stifled creativity, and whole versions of who you could have become. Imagine a large old hall where all the doors remain closed. Behind each of them there is a part of your own soul, waiting to be recognized. For years, you continue to walk only through the main hallway, believing that that space represents your entire existence. But behind these doors, there remains an entire life that has never been allowed to exist. With each choice based only on fear, one more lock is reinforced, and then strange signs start to appear. You find someone living exactly the kind of life you've always imagined for yourself, and you feel an unexpected mixture of wonder and sadness. He receives an important promotion, and a few hours later, experiences a feeling of emptiness that is difficult to explain. He achieves what he has wanted for years, but he realizes that joy disappears much faster than he imagined. The ego interprets these experiences as ingratitude. Jung would interpret them as messages from the unconscious. There is something deeply mysterious about this process. The more you try to ignore this inner calling, the more it finds new ways to appear, sometimes through recurring dreams, other times through unexpected encounters, books that seem to answer age-old questions, seemingly unjustified crises, or events that completely alter the direction of life. Jung called many of these experiences synchronicities, not because he believed in magical coincidences, but because he realized that the psyche has surprising ways of leading consciousness to where it needs to go. But there's a limit to how long persona can keep this battle under control. There comes a time when the weight of life not lived becomes too great. The tension builds silently for years until a single loss, a single disappointment, or a single failure is enough to break the entire structure built by the ego. What seems like an isolated event, in fact, is just the last link in a chain that began much earlier. It is at this point that most believe that everything is ending. However, Carl Jung would see exactly the opposite. For him, when the persona can no longer sustain its own illusion, the real journey finally begins. And what you called stability reveals its most unexpected face. Perhaps it has never been security. Maybe it was just the most comfortable prison you've ever learned to call life. Here is the continuation, maintaining the progression of Part 2. Carl Jung as the central presence, the structure of the original script, symbolic and contemplative language, in addition to the requested narrative breaks. The biggest mistake of human beings is to believe that collapse happens on the day everything falls apart. Carl Jung saw this idea as an illusion created by the ego. The real rupture begins much earlier, when the soul realizes that it is living an existence that no longer belongs to it. The failure only makes visible what had been happening in silence for years. What seems like a sudden fall is in reality the moment when the structure built by persona loses the ability to hide the truth. That's why so many people describe major crises by saying, "I felt like this was going to happen." The unconscious is always known. Only conscience insisted on not listening. There is an ancient image present in different spiritual traditions that Carl Jung interpreted as a universal archetype. Walk through a narrow door to find a completely unknown space. This door does not represent a physical place. It represents a psychological state. While the persona remains strong, this passage seems invisible. But when the ego begins to lose its references, the entrance finally appears before those who are willing to see it. It is exactly at this moment that the hero's journey stops being a story about legendary characters and starts to happen within the mind itself. Joseph Campbell called this moment the threshold crossing. Jung went even deeper. For him, there is no true awakening without the individual crossing regions of the unconscious where no social identity can survive. The soul must abandon that which it has learned to call security in order to discover that which could never be found within it. The curious thing is that almost everyone resists until the last moment, not because they wish to remain in prison, but because they confuse the death of the persona with death itself. But let me ask you a question. How many decisions in your life were born of freedom? And how many were born only from the fear of losing acceptance? If everything that sustains his identity disappeared tomorrow, who would remain in front of the mirror? Most have never had the courage to face this question.
Instead, it continues to strengthen the persona, accumulating achievements, responsibilities, and new masks. However, that which remains hidden in the shadow does not cease to exert influence. On the contrary, the longer it remains unconscious, the more strength it acquires. Jung observed that the shadow does not seek to destroy the person. It seeks to complete what was left unfinished.
The problem is that, when ignored for a long time, its manifestation ceases to be subtle and begins to assume forms that the ego interprets as chaos. That's why some people, after years of living a seemingly perfect routine, abandon everything unexpectedly. Others develop illnesses with no apparent cause, enter deep existential crises, or experience a sense of loss of meaning that no success can alleviate. The common view interprets these events as deviations. Jung saw exactly the opposite.
For him, they were desperate attempts by the psyche to restore the lost balance between the persona and the self. Imagine a gigantic tree growing over a spring. For many years, its roots slowly block the flow of water. On the surface, everything continues to look healthy. The trunk remains firm, the leaves remain green, and no one notices what happens underground, until the moment comes when the accumulated pressure breaks through the ground. It was not the spring that appeared at that moment. It has always been there. It just couldn't be contained. This is what happens with human consciousness. The self has never disappeared. He was just waiting for the moment when the persona would completely no longer control the passage. And then another question arises. Could it be that what you call stability has always been balance, or just a silence produced by the fear of change? How many opportunities has your soul buried to preserve an identity that never represented your true nature? There is a fascinating detail in Carl Jung's studies that few people realize. He never described individuation as a comfortable path. On the contrary, the closer the consciousness gets to the self, the greater the feeling of disorientation. This happens because the ego loses its old reference points before new meanings can be born. This interval is extremely uncomfortable. Many interpret this emptiness as a definitive failure. Jung called it an ongoing transformation. It is during this period that curious phenomena begin to emerge. Books seem to appear at exactly the right time. Unknown people say phrases that remain echoing for weeks. Dreams become more intense. Old memories return with unexpected clarity. Reality itself seems to answer questions that have never been uttered aloud. Jung described these events through the idea of synchronicity, not as supernatural events, but as manifestations of a symbolic intelligence present in the relationship between consciousness and unconscious. The further you go, the more you realize that what seemed like chance may never have been just a coincidence. Perhaps the encounter that changed his life happened just as his old identity was about to crumble. Perhaps that loss you spent years grieving prevented you from continuing to live an existence completely disconnected from your true destiny. Perhaps even your biggest failures have been invisible movements leading you down a path that your persona would never have the courage to choose. Now think sincerely. What if most of your story hadn't been written by your conscious choices? What if the unconscious was driving your evolution long before you realized that there was a path? This possibility is frightening because it dismantles one of the ego's greatest illusions, that of believing that it is in absolute control of one's own life. This is exactly where the hero's journey reaches its most decisive stage. Campbell described this moment as the entrance into the belly of the whale, the symbolic space where all previous identity ceases to make sense. Jung saw this descent as the inevitable encounter with the depths of the psyche. There is no map to cross this territory. There is no technique capable of avoiding its darkness. Only one certainty remains. Those who enter carrying only the persona can never leave in the same way. And perhaps this is precisely what the unconscious has always expected from the first moment you believed that your greatest failure had destroyed your life. There is an old alchemical engraving that deeply intrigued Carl Jung. It depicts a man being swallowed by a gigantic creature, while all around observers believe they are witnessing its destruction. However, the alchemists never interpreted the scene as a death. To them, this man was entering the only place where he could be born again. Jung realized that this symbol appeared long before alchemy crossed mythologies, religions, and spiritual traditions, and always carried exactly the same meaning. True transformation begins when the old identity
ceases to find any possibility of continuing to exist. It is exactly at this point that almost everyone believes that God has abandoned them, that fate has been unfair, or that life has completely lost its meaning. But Jung saw another reality hidden behind this apparent chaos. He stated that the unconscious has an intelligence of its own. When the persona becomes too rigid and prevents individuation, the psyche itself begins to produce events capable of breaking up that which can no longer continue. Not because it wants to punish the individual, but because it seeks to restore the balance between the ego and the self. This idea seems uncomfortable until we find real stories that defy any simplistic interpretation. Jung reported numerous clinical cases of people who only discovered their true vocation after losing everything they had built. Men who had spent decades pursuing brilliant careers, only to realize during a deep crisis that they had never lived up to their own nature. Women who, after the end of relationships considered perfect by everyone around, found for the first time a sense of authenticity that they had never experienced. In almost all of these accounts, there was a surprising pattern. Suffering did not create a new person. It only removed what hid who she had always been. There is another curious detail that Jung noted repeatedly. Many people, just before major changes in their lives, began to have extremely vivid dreams. Some dreamed that their old houses were crumbling. Others crossed unknown forests or descended endless stairs to dark places. Jung did not treat these images as simple fantasies. For him, they were symbolic messages from the unconscious announcing that an inevitable transformation had already begun, long before any external change took place. Maybe you've never thought about it, but how many times has a dream remained in your memory for years without you understanding its meaning? And how many situations that seemed completely negative only revealed their true purpose much later? Joseph Campbell found exactly the same pattern when studying the great myths of humanity. The hero never receives his greatest revelation before losing his references. First comes the separation, then the isolation, then the descent into the unknown. Only then does the encounter with something infinitely greater than his former identity take place. Campbell called this stage the belly of the whale. Jung saw in him the inevitable plunge into the deep unconscious, where the persona simply stops working. Think of a caterpillar inside the cocoon. For a long time, it was believed that it only grew wings slowly until it became a butterfly. Science has revealed something far more impressive. Inside the cocoon, the caterpillar's body practically dissolves. Much of its structure disappears before the new form can emerge. It is such a radical process that if one were to observe only the means of transformation, one would believe that all life had been destroyed. But precisely at that apparent end, a new organization quietly begins to be born. Jung used similar images because he understood that psychological transformation follows a similar logic. The ego interprets the disappearance of the old identity as a tragedy. The self recognizes it as a necessity. They are two completely different perspectives on the same event. While the persona asks, "How can I get back what I've lost?" the unconscious asks a much deeper question. Who will you be now that you can no longer continue pretending to be who you never were? There is a little-known story about Jung that reveals a lot about this understanding. After breaking off his intellectual partnership with Sigmund Freud, he entered one of the most difficult periods of his life. For years, he experienced intense dreams, symbolic visions, and a deep sense of disorientation. Many colleagues believed that he was on the verge of a psychological breakdown. Jung himself wrote that he felt as if he were descending into the depths of an unknown ocean, with no guarantee of being able to return. Instead of running away from this experience, he made an unlikely decision. He decided to record everything he saw, drew symbols daily, and consciously dialogued with the images that emerged from his unconscious. This process gave rise to the famous Red Book, one of the most mysterious and fascinating works in psychology. What seemed like a devastating crisis turned out to reveal concepts that would forever transform the understanding of the human mind. This episode shows something extraordinary. What separates a transformed person from one destroyed by pain is not always the intensity of the suffering. It is often the willingness to stay long enough within it without immediately trying to rebuild the old persona. But here, an extremely subtle trap arises. When the pain finally subsides,
Almost everyone feels an urgent need to return to who they were before. They seek the same type of recognition, repeat old relationship patterns, recreate the same routines, and believe they are regaining stability. However, Carl Jung warned that this attempt at reconstruction could be even more dangerous than the collapse itself. A persona rebuilt on the same foundations becomes even more fragile because now the unconscious has already revealed what it was trying to hide. Maybe that's why some people experience exactly the same failure over and over again, just with different scenarios. They move to another city, change jobs, start new relationships, but conflicts return in strikingly similar ways. It's not bad luck. It is not cruel fate. It is the shadow trying to be seen again. The unconscious repeats what consciousness insists on ignoring. There is a defining moment in every hero's journey that rarely gets attention. It is not when the hero defeats his greatest enemy. It's not when he finds the treasure. It is when he accepts to remain in the unknown without demanding immediate answers. Carl Jung understood that this was the most difficult stage of individuation. Remain silent, endure uncertainty, allowing the old self to fade away before deciding who will be next. It is precisely in this empty space, where the ego believes there is absolutely nothing, that the self slowly begins to reveal its true voice. Before introducing the sequel, I kept the narrative progression of parts 1-4. Carl Jung remains the central presence. The hero's journey continues to be interpreted by the process of individuation, and this fifth part emotionally prepares the viewer for closure, intensifying the tension without anticipating the conclusion. There's a moment in the crossing when the greatest threat is no longer suffering. The real threat becomes the temptation to stop the transformation before it ends. Carl Jung understood this in a profound way when he observed hundreds of people who were going through intense crises. Many managed to survive the loss. Few allowed the loss to transform them. Most of them quickly rebuilt a new persona to fill the void left by the old one. They changed their appearance, profession, relationship, or speech, but remained imprisoned in the same invisible structure. They just built a more sophisticated mask. This is exactly where the process of individuation becomes more demanding. The ego, tired of uncertainty, begs for stability. He wants immediate answers. He wants to regain control. He wants to feel again that he knows who he is. But the self remains silent, not because it has abandoned you, but because there is a truth that cannot be taught before it is lived. Jung stated that some understandings never come through the intellect. They arise only after the old identity completely loses the ability to command existence. Think about how many times you've promised that you'd change your life after a major crisis. Perhaps he said that he would never accept a certain type of relationship again, that he would respect his own boundaries, or that he would finally follow a truer path. However, months later, he realized that he was repeating exactly the same patterns. People changed, the scenarios changed, but the story remained practically identical. This happens because the unconscious does not respond to the words you pronounce. He responds to the structure that continues to govern his choices. Jung observed a curious phenomenon in his patients. Whenever someone believed they had completely resolved their conflicts, a short time later, a new situation arose that revealed an even deeper layer of the shadow. It was not a failure of the process. It was precisely the proof that the psyche continued to lead consciousness to greater and greater levels of integration. The unconscious never works to humiliate the individual. He works to make it whole. There is an ancient initiatory tradition that said that gold is never born on the surface of the earth. It remains hidden for thousands of years, compressed by unseen forces, until someone agrees to descend into the depths to find it. Jung often used alchemy as a symbolic language because he realized that it described exactly the same movement of the human soul. Gold has never represented material wealth. It represented the realization of the self, but no alchemist found gold without first facing darkness, heat, pressure, and dissolution. In the same way, no consciousness achieves true transformation while trying to preserve intact the persona that has always limited it. Perhaps this is why so many people confuse spiritual evolution with emotional comfort. They believe that awakening means eliminating conflict, living permanently in peace, or never experiencing fear again. Jung never taught this. For him, becoming conscious meant expanding the ability to sustain one's own paradoxes. Light does not eliminate the shadow,
It allows you to see it without running away from it. Fear does not disappear. He stops commanding his decisions. Pain does not lose its existence. She loses the power to define her identity. There is a powerful image that runs through virtually every spiritual tradition: the crossing of a desert. The desert never appears as a punishment. It represents a space where all distractions disappear. There is no applause. There are no titles. There are no masks capable of impressing someone. Only the individual remains before his own conscience. Jung saw in this symbol one of the most accurate portrayals of individuation. The psychological desert is the place where the ego stops receiving external nourishment and needs to find out if there is any inner source capable of sustaining it. It is precisely in this silence that many people experience an unexpected revelation. They begin to realize that they have spent years trying to win approval from people who were also hiding behind their own personas. They discover that they have competed for goals that were never born of their true desires. They understand that a large part of their choices were determined by inherited fears, family expectations, or collective patterns that they never questioned. This realization can be deeply painful, but it is also liberating. For the first time, consciousness ceases to confuse adaptation with authenticity. There is a fascinating detail about Carl Jung that few know. In the last years of his life, when he was already recognized worldwide, he stated that he still continued to learn from the unconscious. He never declared that he had completed his individuation. He never claimed to have achieved a definitive version of himself. This humility reveals an essential truth. The self is not a destination where we have finally arrived. It is a living center that continues to reveal itself as long as we exist. Each cycle that ends prepares an even deeper one. But just when everything seems to start making sense, Persona's last trap appears. It takes an extremely subtle form. Instead of wishing to return to the old character, she tries to transform her own transformation into a new identity. The person starts to define himself as someone enlightened, awakened, or completely different from others. Without realizing it, he builds a new mask using his own spiritual experiences. Jung warned that this was one of the most difficult dangers to recognize. The ego can put on even the clothes of wisdom. Maybe you've already met someone like that. People who constantly talk about consciousness, evolution, and self-knowledge, but react with arrogance whenever they are contradicted. Others accumulate spiritual knowledge for years, but remain unable to look honestly at their own shadow. The true process of individuation does not produce superiority. It produces simplicity. The closer one is to the self, the less the need to prove anything becomes. And then the most unexpected twist of the entire hero's journey happens. The individual realizes that he has never been fighting against the world. He was never facing fate, not even fighting their failures. The battle has always been between two versions of himself. On the one hand, the persona trying to preserve a history built by fear. On the other, the self, patiently awaiting the moment when truth would become more important than security. When this understanding finally matures, something quietly changes. The anxiety to recover the past disappears. The need to explain each event loses strength. Even old sufferings begin to take on a completely different meaning. Failure is no longer seen as an interruption of life and is recognized as the instrument that broke the invisible prison of consciousness. But there is still a decisive step, the most important of all, because understanding this truth is not enough. It is necessary to learn to live from it, and it is exactly in this last step that Carl Jung reveals the deeper meaning of the transformation that accompanied his entire life. Before concluding, this, Part 6, maintains the narrative line built in the previous parts. Carl Jung remains as the guide of the journey. The process of individuation reaches its apex, and the closure transforms the reflection into a practical application, preserving the essence of the original script. There is a question that Carl Jung spent practically his entire life trying to answer. Wasn't it how to avoid suffering, nor how to achieve success? The question that really accompanied him was much deeper. Who would you be if you stopped living to protect an identity that never represented your true essence? This question continues to cross generations because it does not belong only to psychology. It belongs to the very experience of existing. Perhaps you now understand that your greatest failure was never an accident, perhaps you will realize that many of the events you seem to curse were quietly making room for something that could never be born as long as the persona remained in control. The ego called these moments losses. The self recognized them as passages. Consciousness has experienced them as pain. The soul understood them as liberation. Joseph Campbell said that the hero never returns from the journey bringing only one prize. He returns bringing a new way of seeing reality. Jung took this idea even further. For him, the real treasure is not in the outside world. It is in the reconciliation between what you show the world and what you really are. This is the deepest meaning of individuation. It's not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming whole. But there is something that deserves to be remembered. Transformation doesn't happen because you've watched a video, read a book, or intellectually understood those ideas. The unconscious is not modified only by knowledge. It is transformed by conscious experience. This is where this journey stops being a philosophical reflection and becomes a daily practice. In the coming days, observe your own life as Carl Jung would. Whenever you feel an intense emotional reaction, don't immediately ask who's wrong. Ask which part of your shadow was just touched. Whenever an unexpected fear arises in the face of an important change, instead of running away, ask which persona is trying to preserve their territory. Whenever you experience a persistent feeling of emptiness, don't try to fill it immediately with distractions. Allow yourself to remain silent for a few minutes. Often it is precisely in this space that the unconscious finds the opportunity to reveal what it has been trying to show for years. Create a simple habit. At the end of each day, write 3 questions in a notebook. Have I made any decisions based on fear alone? At what point did I feel like I was playing a role instead of acting authentically? And what small attitude brought my consciousness closer to my true self? Don't try to answer perfectly. Just watch. Jung believed that that which receives conscious attention slowly begins to lose its invisible hold on life. Another exercise may seem simple, but it has enormous transformative force. Remember a failure that still causes pain when it comes back to your memory. For a long time, you probably wondered why that happened. Today, try to completely invert the question. Ask what that happened for. What did that loss make impossible to keep hiding? What direction did it reveal? Which version of you ceased to exist at that moment? You may find that the event you most tried to forget was the very one that initiated your true awakening. It is also worth observing the synchronicities that arise from now on. Maybe a book will appear unexpectedly. Perhaps a conversation will reveal exactly the answer you were looking for. Perhaps a dream awakens an old memory, or a person enters your life at a time when you least expected it. Jung never suggested living by looking for signs in everything, but he taught that an awakened consciousness learns to recognize when certain events carry a meaning that goes beyond simple coincidence. The more attentive you are, the more you will realize that life dialogues with those who finally decide to listen to it. There is still a truth that can completely change the way you face the future. You don't need to eliminate your shadow. You don't have to destroy your ego. You don't have to completely abandon your persona. All these structures have a function. The problem was never their existence. The problem arises when one of them takes absolute control of consciousness. True wisdom consists in allowing everyone to take their place, while the self becomes the silent center, capable of guiding each decision. You may still face further losses. Perhaps other cycles will end. Maybe life will continue to lead you to unknown regions. But now there is a fundamental difference. You know that every crisis can hide an opportunity for individuation. He knows that every collapse can reveal a forgotten part of his soul. And he knows that what seems like the end of a story may be just the beginning of the one he has always waited to be lived. Carl Jung wrote that his life was the story of the realization of the unconscious, not from the realization of his ambitions, nor from the conquest of recognition, but from the slow manifestation of that which existed in the depths of the psyche and sought to become conscious. Perhaps this is also his true story. Perhaps his failures were never interruptions. Perhaps they were life's way of keeping you from spending your entire existence playing a character while your true essence remained forgotten. When you're done with this video, don't immediately go back to the rush. Take a few minutes. Breathe deeply. Notice the silence. Ask yourself which mask you no longer want to carry. Ask which part of your life was born out of fear and which was born out of truth. And above all, have the courage to take a small step in the direction of what your consciousness has long recognized. Transformation rarely begins with a major revolution. It begins when a single decision is no longer guided by the persona and starts to be inspired by the self. If this reflection has found something true within you, don't allow it to end here. Write in the comments, what was the idea that most aroused your awareness? If you prefer to preserve your identity, comment anonymously. The important thing is to record this moment for yourself and inspire others who are also going through their own hero's journey. Leave your like so that this content reaches those who may be experiencing exactly the same transformation process. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring Carl Jung's ideas, depth psychology, archetypes, the shadow, the self, and the paths of true individuation. Perhaps the next video is exactly the answer your unconscious has been waiting to find.